Hello, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Sweetbats, and to celebrate my first year on YouTube, I'll be working with this well-loved dot-dead gorgeous Spectra Vondergeist, who is in dire need of a makeover. With her white face, invisible limbs, and the season of spooky things being upon us, she's the perfect candidate for transforming into Monsieur Loyal, ringmaster of the Cirque du Gothique. Loyal is an NPC on Gaia Online, created by Faerin Pickpocket, and based off her own OC, Loyal. I felt it was best to go with the Gaia version rather than making a doll of the OC of someone I don't know, especially since I'm sending the final product to my friend as a birthday gift. Also, this doll is part of a massive Halloween collaboration hosted by Doll Color on Instagram. Please be sure to check out the Halloween 2019 Doll Collab tag for all the other fabulous entries. I'll put links in the description for you to check out. This isn't the first collab I've joined, but the deadline was sooner, so stay tuned for the other small collab by the end of the year. I'm starting with an acetone test on her broken arm to give it an invisible look, as I'm pretty sure that the lower arms are a different type of plastic that can handle acetone, but if it can't, then it's no big loss. Please be extremely careful when working with chemicals. I'm not using gloves since I'm using such a small amount and it's nail polish remover instead of hardware store strength, but be sure to protect your skin and work in a well-ventilated area. And you shouldn't be messing with this if you're a child. It seems to work without issue, so I do both arms, then switch to non-acetone nail polish remover to test on the legs since I wasn't entirely sure if acetone worked there. It didn't seem to be doing much, so I used the acetone soaked cotton ball and tested it at the bottom of the feet, and it seemed to be working, so I continued with that. I actually noticed it getting a bit cloudy on the legs and couldn't tell if it was melting or just the paint was smudging, so I finished off camera next to the sink to rinse off the legs after each pass. It seems, at least for Spectra, acetone can be used on the hands, lower arms, and lower legs to remove the paint. Next up is removing the face, so I soak a cotton ball in acetone nail polish remover and wipe the face off. You can see just how stained she is once the paint is removed, so I begin thinking about how I'm going to get her face completely white. In the meantime, I take a blow dryer to her neck to remove the head, then cut off what's left of her hair and scrape at the plugs through the neck peg with needle nose pliers and forceps. There weren't really any fun chunks of hair to pull out this time, so I'm speeding through these preparation parts, since I've noticed I tend to spend too much time on them in my videos, and if you've made it to my channel, you've seen this process hundreds of times on the bigger channels anyway. Once the hair is all out and the paint is cleaned up from the scalp, even more stains are visible. I decide to try the benzoyl peroxide treatment, dabbing a thin layer on the stains and leaving the head in the sun. Be sure to wash your hands afterward. I've actually burned my face when I put a thin layer on my skin overnight, so this stuff is really strong. Here is the head after 10 days in the sun, and I can see it has lightened a bit, but it's not as effective as I wanted. At this point, I realize I need to slather the cream on instead of only putting on thin layers, so off camera, I do just that and set the head back in the sun. While I wait on the head, I start on the body. Since I will need both full arms and I don't need the gloves, I switch limbs around with another Spectra and set that aside to deal with later, then clean the new arm and hands with pure acetone. Because Loyal is male, I want to flatten the chest, so I use my rotary tool and put on a dust mask and goggles to protect myself from the flying bits of plastic, and slowly but surely begin shaving down the chest. If you have longer hair, be sure to pull it out of the way so it doesn't get caught, and again, children should be staying away from power tools. I can't tell you how many times I've come close to injuring myself due to this tool slipping and running toward my hand. I'm really lucky I don't have bladed attachments for it, given how accident-prone I've been with this. This is the first time I've modified a doll chest, and I make sure to work slowly and carefully so that I don't end up shaving off too much of the plastic and exposing the hollow part of the chest. It takes a lot of time. The unedited video of this process is over half an hour long, but I do finally get it to a level I'm rather satisfied with, and this will be covered with clothing anyways, so I'm not too worried about getting it perfect. If I wanted it to be more accurate, I would have done heavier modifications in reshaping that dramatic back arch, but that's something to do on a future project. Here's the final result, and I'm overall pretty pleased with it, and honestly amazed I didn't file down a hole in the chest. It's not really male passing, but it's a significant difference when placed next to an unaltered doll. I don't recall if I came back in again after to touch it up a bit, but for the most part, this is what it looks like all done. Moving back to the head that's still coated in dried benzoyl peroxide, I decide to begin the reroute process, starting from the back in the event I need to airbrush the face. Using Karen's Simply Soft acrylic yarn in gold, I cut small lengths, unravel the yarn, and stab it into the head using a needle cut at an angle held by an X-Acto knife handle. I come back shortly to paint the scalp in a matching color so any gaps in the hair aren't as unsightly. This is something that you should actually be doing before you begin the reroute process. The benzoyl peroxide has already started peeling from the reroute process, so I remove it from the hairline and plan to airbrush the face with white paint later to ensure it matches Loyal's face makeup. Once it's dry, I wash the face of the rest of the benzoyl peroxide, seal the scalp with a layer of Mod Podge, and continue plugging in the rest of the hair. And here's the hair in all its poofy glory. After gluing all the hair down with Fabri-Tac through the neck peg, I take a small section and use a pet brush to comb out the yarn and go over it with a flea comb for detail work close to the scalp. And now it's even poofier than before. I section it out again and use a straightener on a low heat setting to smooth out the hair. This ended up being a pretty long process, so next time I do a reroute, I'll straighten it at the same time that I brush it and see if that helps cut down the time at all. Once it's all straightened, I pin the hair back, airbrush the face, seal it with Mr. Super Clear, and finally begin working on the face. Please keep in mind that Mr. Super Clear, like many aerosols, is toxic and should only be used with proper respiratory protection. I cannot stress enough how dangerous it is, just like many aspects of this hobby, to be handled by children, so only adults should be doing this. Keeping a bunch of reference images up on my computer, I start with a light color since it will be easier to erase any mistakes, and begin laying out the basic shapes of the eyes. I try to give him more narrowed eyes, and unfortunately, it looks as if I can't use my eraser pencil to easily fix mistakes on an airbrushed face without leaving a pink stain, so I reluctantly switch to my kneaded eraser. The color I chose ended up being a bit too light, and I was straining to see my own drawings, so I changed to a darker color to continue setting up guidelines to work off of later. I struggle a little with getting the makeup on the eyes to look just right, as I wanted it to be dramatic and true to the character, but not look feminine. Overall, I think I did a decent job with it. I think the scar over the eye ended up being my favorite part of his face. I kind of dreaded doing the eyebrows since not only do I already struggle with them, but they're supposed to be a bright yellow, which I had a ton of difficulty seeing, even after darkening the shade a few times. I'm not pleased with the color, but I do eventually get the shape to what I want. To try and get the other side to match, I turn the head upside down, which is actually a pretty useful trick. If you're ever stuck with symmetry, try and get another angle, whether it's taking a picture and mirroring it, or working upside down. I give Loyal an upturned smirk and define the inner line of the lips, doing my best to keep my head out of the shot, before filling in the iris of the one eye that has color. I start with a lighter shade so I can define it later with darker shades built on top. At this point, I'm feeling really confident in my guidelines, so I retrace them in black twice. I'm really happy with how far I managed to take the face in just one layer. Once I'm done laying down the black pencil, I get my gloves, goggles, and respirator on, and seal in my work with the spray of Mr. Super Clear, giving it at least 30 minutes to dry before working on building up more colors in the next layer. Off camera, I build up the yellows a bit more, then come in with Mungyo Soft Pastels to add more definition to the eyelids and lips.
One of my biggest struggles with this face-up was deciding if I should stick entirely to the design, which ends up looking a little flat when translated to a doll, or making more changes that enhance a three-dimensional version, but also ensuring the makeup doesn't look too feminine. In the end, I'm glad I went with the choices I made, as I really feel that they help bring the character to life, even if it's not entirely accurate. Plus, I think the shadow really helps the iris look stunning.
Here's the result after finishing up the lips and other eyelid and adding a bit of shading on the whites of the eyes. I seriously cannot express how much I love it. I add some gray pastels to contour the face, trying to keep it more subtle around Spectra's already well-defined cheekbones, and instead focus on the forehead and nose. After that, it's just a matter of continuing to build up colors until I'm satisfied. I don't have a ton of usable footage of this since my head kept blocking the camera, but I take a color that wanted to keep breaking and carefully define the eyebrows, still keeping the yellow as the focus, but making them more visible against the bright white skin. Loyal's design has one eye with no iris, just a pupil, but I opted to go with the light gray eye, and I'm so glad I did. I think it's a vast improvement on the doll. I'm pretty much done with the face, so now it's time for fun with Pearl X powders. I use the gold micro glitter to enhance the eye, making sure to remove any shimmer that falls outside of the iris. To try and keep the eyeshadow and eyelashes from blending together too much, I use black acrylic paint on a tiny brush to line the eyes. White acrylic paint comes next for the catch lights. Then a layer of micro glitter all over the face, before the head goes out for a final spray of Mr. Super Clear. The final step is Tamiya acrylic gloss on the eyes. I go with 2 layers to make them super shiny, and once that's all dry, the face-up is done. I remove the protective wrap from the hair, and you can see where both airbrush paint and MSC got on the yarn. I do my best to comb this out as much as possible, trim the ends, and then style the hair. I don't have any footage of this, unfortunately, but I basically sectioned off clumps of hair and gelled them into a point with either glue or Axe Messy Look paste, depending on how the hair wanted to cooperate. I also made a small clay shape on a pin, wrapped some hair around it, and stuck it into the head to represent the little swirl his hair has. I'm sorry for not filming most of the remaining processes. I wasn't super confident with them and didn't know how well they'd work. I used the vest from DG Requiem's Business Basics and traced the pattern onto yellow fabric before painting over it with this gold fabric paint. I forgot to do it on this piece, but be sure to fray check your fabrics, especially when working with such a small scale. Off camera, I make a modified jacket from the same pattern set, as well as pants from the 70s pattern. I'll link her shop in the description. Please go check out her fantastic work. I glue the front of the vest together after hemming it with liquid stitch, and paint buttons on the front with black acrylics. To cut down on bulk, I make pieces for the visible parts of the shirt to glue under the vest instead of sewing a full collared shirt, and I mix up a dark gray paint to paint the design onto these, a tie I made, and the ascot. I cut up a note card, draw on the letters and suits for his playing cards with watercolor pencils, then use packing tape to essentially laminate the cards and keep them in the shape I want. Off screen, I make a top hat with essentially the same concept. However, the note card pieces for the hat and the decorations on top are wrapped in fabric. Painted clay shapes and fabric are also glued on to finalize the details. Again, sorry this wasn't filmed. To keep the tape secure on the cards, I use an iron to try to melt the adhesive to the paper. I make tiny diamond and heart pieces out of air-dry clay and poke a hole in them before they fully dry so I can attach them later. Once they're hardened, I paint them gold and set them aside to dry. Make sure to set down something to protect your work surface whenever you paint. I hadn't made the hat at this point, but here's everything that had been made so far. For the vest, you can see where I glued the shirt pieces on, as well as the tie, which has the diamond piece affixed to it with a small chain sewn on. I also attached snap closures for this piece.
The ascot got the heart piece and a chain, which will be fully sewn on once the doll is assembled. This will not really be a removable piece, so I have to wait on this to be fully completed, but you can see an idea of how it will look when done. The pants are pretty simple, but I added a belt out of small painted fabric pieces, which is fully attached to the pants and cannot be separated. I also got a bit lazy and only used Velcro as the closure for this piece. And finally, the jacket. I'm surprisingly pleased with how it turned out, given how modified from a pattern it had to be. I glued a pocket inside to hold the cards, and didn't put a closure on this, as it's meant to be worn open. I tried to make some shoes by making a cast of an existing pair, but one part of my silicone had gone bad and was unusable, so I gave Siligum a try, with less than optimal results. This stuff is good for when you compress something directly into it to cast, but not so much when you need to fill areas, like the inside of a shoe. Additionally, the resin leaked out of the slits that I made to get the original shoe out of the mold, so that's my fault for not sealing the mold well enough. Still, I work with what I got and file it down with my rotary tool before painting the shoes black. Referencing the fabulous shoe tutorials from Walker Colors, who I'll link below, I traced the shoe and leg and modified from there to make a template for the fabric piece to go over the shoe. This is the pattern piece I end up with, and I traced 4 of these, with 2 reversed, onto my fabric, sew a normal and reverse piece together on both the front and back, and put them on basically like leg warmers over the shoes. The finished pieces have a couple small painted designs on them, but I think it's about time to get to the final product. I think it's an understatement to say that I'm really happy with how this turned out. I found that some of my best work occurs when I'm making something specifically for someone else, and I honestly feel that this one is my best work so far. I managed to get this finished and delivered before my friend's birthday, which was certainly a nice surprise for both of us. Even though the date is almost a month past, give my friend a birthday shout out in the comments. Thanks to all of my subscribers for making this a wonderful first year, and I hope that I can continue to make content that keeps you coming back. Stay safe and spooky this Halloween. I'll see you next time. Take care.